The Other 51, the podcast where your favorite writers tell you all of their secrets and their tricks of the trade. My name is Brian Moritz. Thank you for listening wherever you get your podcasts. And this month, our guest is someone I've been lucky to call a friend and a mentor for going on 30 years now. That's
God, no, don't say that to people. They'll think I'm old. And they'll think you're old too.
Jeez, we're doomed from the start. Anyway, he is a senior sports columnist at the New York Post, a fellow son of St. Bonaventure, and the author of the new book, Bosses of the Bronx, The Endless Drama of the Yankees Under the House of Steinbrenner, which is out today. Mike Vaccaro, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Brian. It's always great to be with you, and I really appreciate you having me on to chat about the book. It's going to be fun, and I appreciate that generous introduction, despite the number of years I realize I know you.
That's terrible. It is terrifying on every level.
I mean, I see my father talk about friends that he knew for 30, 40 years. I'm like, my God, how old are you? And now I've got nothing but friends.
Right. So. No, 1990. That was 10 years ago. No, it wasn't.
No, it was not.
It was not. So the book is out today. It is such a fun read. I had a blast reading it. So I'm curious, as much fun as writing a book can be, given the fact that it's writing a book in a process, was it fun to put together? Because it really kind of comes through as a page that this is a labor of love and a fun little read.
You know what, Brian? I'm going to give you the same answer that I gave our mutual friend Jeff Pearlman a couple of days ago when he and I were talking about it. And he's one of these guys who suffers and bleeds with every word, you know, and it shows because his books are just unbelievable. I find it to be a pleasure. You know, I also use words like privilege because I just have to be able to write a book is a privilege, but to do it to me is a pleasurable event. I just really enjoy writing. I still do. And the way I do it, this is the fourth book I've written. I've never taken a sabbatical for my day job. And people say, not even a week, not even 2 weeks. And I say no, because honestly, I think it helps. When I'm writing a book, it helps both disciplines because they're so different. When I'm writing my column, it's coming out in 750 word bursts after a lot of reporting usually on an intense deadline. And the book, a lot of times is done, or every time is done, 1,500 words at a time, 2,000 words at a time, 750 words at a time. But, a lot of care put into it. You get up and down a lot more than you're able to with a column. So they're two different disciplines, and I enjoy them both. And there are a lot of days that I do them both. I'll do, 1,200 words in my book in the afternoon, and then I'll have to cover a Knicks game at night and have to be able to write, 700 words in 23 minutes. And it's, there are different challenges, but I like both those challenges. And I really do that. I do think that both, ways of writing inform the other.
So you mentioned that this is your fourth book and your first book since 2009. So I'm curious what brought you back to book writing after that long break?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that question. All of them equally true. One, I was lucky enough to write those three books over the course of 5 years, which is not a pace I would recommend for anybody. Of course, when I was, as we all are in our younger days, Brian, we're all young men and women in a hurry, right? So, I figured I would keep that pace up for 30 years. And honestly, by the time I was done with my third book, which I really enjoyed and did fairly well, but I was just fried by the end of it. And, you say, well, I'm going to take a couple of years off. And next thing you look up, it's 10 years later. And next thing you know, you're having a couple of health issues like I experienced a couple of years ago. And so, when it got to the time I was ready to do this again, I actually had a different idea that I wanted to pitch around town. And I have a terrific agent, Joe Perry, also a Bonaventure man like the two of us. And he's terrific. And he shopped it around. And, there was one editor at HarperCollins who wanted to work with me. He wasn't so sold on the idea we were selling. And as it turned out, whatever that was, this is certainly the better topic. He was dancing around with the Steinbrenner book idea himself, and he'd been reading my work because he's based in New York, and we got together, and I thought it was a terrific idea. There's already been a pretty comprehensive. There's been many Steinbrenner biographies. The most definitive one was written by Bill Madden just before Steinbrenner died, or just after he died. It was around that time, around 2010. It's comprehensive. It's as a biography would be, but we weren't looking to do a biography. We were looking to do a segment of time from the day he bought the team until as recently as present day as a book publishing schedule allows. And so that's what we did. And the real cool part about this, because it was a great partnership with Sean, just one of the great gifted editors you'll ever find, who wasn't only really careful with my copy and invested in my copy, but was also, at the very beginning, he said, I want you to write this like it was 30 columns, 30 chapters, 30 columns. And look, the chapters are longer than my columns are, but I knew what he was saying, just, write this as you would your columns. This isn't a textbook, you've experienced a lot of these things. And even the things you weren't an eyewitness to or privy to, working in New York, you seem to have a pretty good grasp on just about the entirety of the subject matter, which I did. And so that's how it proceeded. I was really lucky, and look, I mean, I had the itch. I mean, even before I got sick a couple of years ago, I really wanted to get back into it, but it just one thing, life passes you, and so I really feel fortunate to be able to go take another bite at the apple with this, because it's I love all the books I've done. I really just enjoy this one. It's a little different than the others, a little more contemporary,
Mhm.
less of a history book, maybe designed for history buffs. And so it's yeah, it's fun. I'm delighted to hear you call it fun and easy, because that's exactly the way I look at it. I think it is a pretty fun and breezy read. A lot of laughs in there, I think, and that's I
Mhm.
think what you really want. If you can provide a little bit of laughter in these times, it's not a bad skill to have.
Well, I mean, Steinbrenner and Billy Martin alone, just that's a comedy.
Yeah,
That's fantastic. I also have to say, one of the things that jumped out at me that stuck with me, I did not expect Richard Nixon to have like the most poignant moment in the entire book. The
yeah,
moment at Billy Martin's funeral. I think he says to Billy's boy, like, look up, hold your head up, look at all the people who loved your dad. I'm like,
yep.
did Richard Nixon just make me like you, like him for 30 seconds?
It was actually kind of a nice circle, right? Because George Steinbrenner got in a lot of trouble by, he gets suspended from baseball the first time for illegally contributing to Nixon's campaign. So I guess that was Nixon's payback all those years later.
So I wanted to dig in because you mentioned in the acknowledgments, your editor and the kind of writing it like 30 columns and that approach. And so how did you, so A, kind of a two-part question. A, why was that such a great kind of like piece of coaching advice for you as a writer? And then B, how did you kind of actually sit down and approach each of the chapters? Because the structure of the book's pretty straightforward. It's chronology from when Steinbrenner shows up to
Yeah.
when to present day. So how did you kind of use that column model almost as a structure and as kind of like a tool to report and write?
Well, the answer to the first question, Brian, is that, I'm not going to say it would have been a deal breaker if he wanted me to do something radically different in terms of my approach to it, as opposed to writing them as I write my columns. But um, that's the way I'm comfortable doing things. I mean, obviously, I haven't written all my books that way. But I really thought that it was going to be the best way to tell the story in my voice. And I think, it may sound a little arrogant, but as I told Sean at the beginning, I'm pretty sure you're paying me to do this because you like my voice. You know what my voice is. I'm not a mystery. Either you like it or you don't, and people can make that judgment. And you've decided to allow me to write this book, so I assume that you trust the voice that I bring to the project. And he said, absolutely. That's the point of it. And it was just knowing before I ever wrote a word that I'll be able to write every word that follows in my voice. Everything that's in that book is me. You know, there's probably there's the director's cut version, which is probably 140 pages longer, which is what Sean helped to carefully and craftily delete, and they were almost all entirely on point, trimmed. So I mean, which is the joy of working with a good editor. But the thing about this book, Brian, which was a little different, that like I used three methods of reporting and researching the book. The first one was a familiar one to me because all of my previous three books had relied pretty heavily on archival newspaper, magazine, whatever. And so I would spend literally weeks at a time locked in the archive room at the New York Public Library, where they have the archives for every New York newspaper that ever existed. I mean, you really just can't find those anywhere. I mean, those are one place and one place only.
Mhm.
But it's a schlep to get into the library and do all this stuff. Steinbrenner's time with the Yankees was entirely a product of a time when the newspapers that covered him from day one are still around in some form or another. So I didn't have to go back to the old New York Mirror or the old Journal American. And as a result of that, because of the advent of things like newspapers.com and newspaperarchives.com, and the Post has its own archival system that I have access to, instead of having to do that, I mean, instead of having to ever leave my house, I didn't. I never left my house. I was able to do it all on my iPad, my iPhone. I was able to do it when I was when I was traveling, whenever I wasn't just constricted. So it made the research not only easier but also fuller because I wasn't limited by any constraints. So
Mhm.
there was nothing that escaped my purview because I was meticulous about reading everything from literally every day that his name was in a newspaper, from the day he bought the team until the day he died, and then since then with Hal and Hank. So there was that aspect of it. Look, I've been covering New York sports since 1998. I was also did a little bit of it a couple of years prior to that in suburban newspaper. So I've been around. So I knew George. I had a relationship with George. I wasn't around George during, I guess, what you would call Apex George in the 70s and 80s when,
Mhm.
he really was the king of the back pages every day, even in like January. But I knew him enough and I experienced a good chunk of the book from 98 on. And so the final 12 years of his life, at least. And so I had all of that to draw on. And, I'm a banana. So, I mean, I literally have all my old notebooks from going
Oh
back to the
wow.
Olean Times Herald, and I have those up in my attic. I have all my, all these old tape recordings. And nowadays, because things are easier in life all the way around, my notes are saved on notebooks. And so a lot of times, my iPhone, tells me that there's no more storage left. I have to pick between my old notes and like a couple of, vacation pictures. So I had a lot of primary reporting. And look, there were a lot of people I talked to in the book, and I say this in the acknowledgments that, I approached them and I said, look, I just want to talk to you for background and to just make sure that there's nothing glaring about any of these stories I'm telling. And if you want to add anything to yourself, I won't quote you. I just want to make sure they're right. And I did that because, look, a lot of the people in here are older. A lot of them were fond of George, even if in the moment they hated him. Um, and so they don't, their on the record tendencies will be a lot softer and probably a lot more inaccurate than what actually happened. If you're going to quote them, if you're not going to quote them, I think they're more apt to just say, "Yeah, this happened." No, no, be careful about this. There was one guy I reached out to, and he insisted that a story that's pretty fundamental part of kind of building what kind of a maniac George could be didn't happen the way it happened. And I got 5, 6 other people who said that's exactly how it happened. And so, look, I mean, I'm sure Goose Gossage doesn't want to have the fat man speech that I detail in there, written again for the 80th time, and because it's a book, I get to use all the words. Um, but he knows that he said it, and he acknowledges he said it. He owns that he said it. He probably doesn't want to talk about it. And so, but, so I didn't want to put anybody on the spot. So that's all on background. And, but they didn't tell me those things. I found those things, every one of those things that I didn't see report myself had already previously been reported. I just wanted to make sure that they were accurate in the sense of how I presented them. And so those three things all played together in making the book, work.
As you're going through Steinbrenner's time with the Yankees and putting together kind of like the chronology of the book, I guess another two-part question, which is terrible interviewing, but we'll go with it. Uh, there are kind of like the main tent pole things that you're going to talk about. Reggie, Catfish Hunter, Billy, the Fat Man speech, all like these, the kind of canonical George events. So how do you kind of approach those as a writer that you're telling what happened, but it's not just the 80th retelling of the Fat Man speech or the 80th retelling of the straw that stirs a drink or something like that.
That's where I go back to, I think, how important it was that Sean was on board with me when it came to writing it in my voice. You know, the nicest thing people ever tell me when they want to give me a compliment, I don't even know if they know they're giving me the compliment, is that I know it's your column even before I see your picture. And so that tells you that you've developed a voice. And it's a voice that that I've developed over 35 years in the business doing this. And so doing it that way, I mean, yeah, the one's a born liar, the other convicted, quote from Billy that caused, one of the great spit storms of all time, has been told a million times, but I've never told it. And so I try and tell it in a little entertaining way, in my own way. But also, look, I mean, here's the other thing that I also knew, and I think that one of the great things about the opportunity to do this book is that there are a lot of people now, a lot of Yankees fans, really so many of them, probably even under 40 now, certainly under 35, who really have no idea what George was like in the 70s and 80s. What they know about George Steinbrenner is the avuncular, guy from the championship years later on, who every time he showed up at Yankee Stadium got a standing ovation. People would chant, "Thank you, George. Thank you, George." Meanwhile, 25 years earlier, they were saying, a different word, you, George, in the stadium, 40,000 strong. And, they don't really know that at that level. I mean, and the fact is, even a lot of people who were there, it's all recency bias. So what they remember is George being the guy. These are the loudest guys who every year want to rip Hal because he doesn't act like his father, as if acting like his father is something he should aspire to.
Right.
So it's so all of that I think is what is going to help. Like I said, as you said, those things were all have all been on the record for years. But some people are going to see him for the first time and will probably say, "There's no way this happened." And it did, and like I said, I mean, it's kind of my spin on the way things happen because, look, I mean. The fact is, and in the moment, I don't think George found it very funny when he was called convicted by his manager. But even I think if he were still around, I mean, now he would tell that story and he would laugh because the same way all the bad stuff that happens to us when we're 22, 26, 29 years old, later on, unless it's really tragic, I mean, you can learn to laugh. I got kicked off my basketball team when I was, when I was 16 years old in high school, and it was the most traumatic thing in the world. And I've gotten nothing but laughter about that story for the last 30 years because it was actually funny. And if you can laugh at yourself, and that's I think part of what this book is trying to find the humor, even in things that didn't seem so funny at the time.
So kind of related to that, to the tentpole question, like, and you obviously you grew up a baseball fan in New York, and you grew up during the time of kind of when George bought the team and was at his peak. When you went back, was there any kind of any stories or any things that either you had forgotten or didn't know about and kind of jumped out at you like, oh, this is I did not know this happened, and kind of became part of the story that way?
A couple of those things. I mean, there was a quote that I found. This is kind of adjacent to your question, but I'll answer the question more directly after I tell you this one. One of the things George was known for as things kind of went south for the Yankees in the 80s and the 90s was that he would there were two Georges. One who understood and was actually ahead of his time in terms of building an infrastructure, a farm system, realizing you couldn't just buy players every year. You actually had to have other players to surround with. And he spent a lot of money investing in infrastructure and farm systems and the best scouts and understanding international play before anybody else did. But the problem is that was the job that was the competent George who was in charge of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. However, the other guy on the masthead equal to him was the idiot fan George, who would just, go. The same kind of people who go crazy when the Yankees lose five in a row in August. That was George Steinbrenner, and as a result, he would fire a manager, he would fire a GM, he would reassign a pitching coach, and he would get rid of guys like Willie McGee and Doug Drabeck and Fred McGriff and on and on. And there was a quote that I found that I loved, and I just found it randomly, and I'd never seen it before. And it was in the Post. I think Maury Allen might have written this sometime in the 80s, and it was a quote of a frustrated Double-A player for the Nashville Sounds, which was a Yankee farm system. And he said basically, he said if you're too good around here, then you'll wind up traded. And if you're not good enough, they're just going to keep bringing players to block you. You'll never get to the big leagues. Buck Showalter got over that after a while, and he actually wound up, managing the
Yeah.
Yankees. But that was one story that I thought was, was interesting. I'd never seen that before. Honestly, the thing that I think the chapter the two things that I enjoyed writing the most was one thing I was actually very much involved in. In revisiting it, I remembered the details a lot better, and the other one was something that I wasn't a part of. And it's funny, the pine tar incident was so crazy, and I remember it being fundamentally crazy. Philip Bondi wrote a great book about it a couple of years ago, and that was terrific. But it had been a while since I read that, and so I was doing this. The day to day of that was just extraordinary, and just Lee McPhail actually deciding that he was gonna uphold a protest. I mean, protests are never upheld, and yet he was able to find a sentence that said that actually the punishment everybody thought for pine tar isn't really the punishment it's supposed to be. It's supposed to take the bat out. And all that stuff went on. So retelling that story the way I did it was, I enjoyed it. I have a good relationship with George Brett, so I had his perspective to draw upon, which is a very, very different perspective than most of the Yankees, obviously. So that story was, while I knew the essentials, I almost liken that to what I think a lot of people who know the stories might think when they read the story, when they read the book, was that in doing the research for it, there was even stuff that I thought I knew about. And look, what I remember the day they replayed the game is that I went to the Police concert at Shea Stadium. It was a great trouble bill, Brian. It was REM right at the beginning of REM, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts and the Police. It was my first concert. It was an unforgettable night. I remember every minute, every song, and I knew that they were playing the game at Yankee Stadium, but I really wasn't paying much attention to that because I had other interests. The other story I'm going to talk about, I guess we have to delicately talk about the details of it here, but there was a moment in spring training in 1999 when George Steinbrenner just went after Hideki Irabu, who was a Japanese pitcher, and it had come to the Yankees with much fanfare, but really never did anything. Had a very sad ending to his life, also. But there was a lot of ballyhoo around this guy, and he just could never live up to the hype, and he was always overweight. And George just went after him one time when he fumbled after a bunt in a practice, and he called him. The proper pronunciation here is a fat pussy toad.
Hmm.
Okay. So when you say it, you can understand it. We all know pussy is like the green ooze that comes out of an infected wound, right? But when you type it, you're not quite sure how to type it. And there's a very similar word that was probably different than what you would want to use. And this was actually one of the great days in, I think, newspaper journalism history, because in every newspaper in New York, there were meetings being held about how exactly to present this word. All
That's
right.
phenomenal. Yeah.
And so like the Daily News just use ellipses. And so did I think News, they just use bleepy toad.
Hmm.
The Post, I wasn't working at the Post yet, but they went with pussy rhymes with fussy in parentheses. Now, I was at the Star Ledger at the time. What you have to understand is that at the Star Ledger, we really, I mean, literally like months before, started a very close relationship with the producers of The Sopranos.
Right.
The Star Ledger was the newspaper that Tony retrieved in his driveway in about 25 different episodes.
Hmm.
And so as a result of that, we wrote a lot of stories about The Sopranos. And there's a main character in the first few seasons of The Sopranos that has
Hmm.
the alternate word as part of his name, and we've been using that unabashedly. And so we finally came across was to spell the word Pussie, pussy, because they said just don't spell it the way we spell, you know,
The other one.
Vincent Bonampiero's nickname. And so that's what we did. So me and Tim Brown, just one of my favorite colleagues of all time, who's got his own book on Nolan Ryan coming out in a couple of months, which is going to be terrific. We had at the end of the day, we solved the great Hideki Irabu caper that way. But I mean, like I lived it, and I barely remember it. But going back and looking at the stuff that we were writing that day, I was like, oh my God, I remember that day. You talk about a unique day.
And that was like the 800th craziest day under
Yeah, and
covering
that's the thing.
Steinbrenner.
That was just happening one that I was there for, and I
Yeah.
was privy to for the entirety of it. I can only imagine. Like I spent a lot of time talking to Henry Hecht, who was the guy who covered one of the guys who covered the crazy Bronx Zoo Yankees of the '70s, and so he was the guy. It was him and Murray Chess of the Times that got Billy Martin after he'd already ripped Reggie Jackson a couple of minutes before to the other writers. They got him in the boarding area at O'Hare Airport to give him the great, the Bartlett's quote of baseball, which is one's a born liar, the other's convicted. That's Billy talking about Reggie Jackson and George Steinbrenner. That's what got him fired the first time. And I asked him, I mean, what was life like that? And he's like, what life? He said there was no life. That's why people kept getting off the beat, because you couldn't do it for more than a few years, because it would kill you. I mean, forget being married, you'd become a homicidal maniac if you had to be around these stories all the time. And there was a lot of turnover on that job. And it's kind of funny because it's just different now, because I mean, the guys in the beat now, they work every bit as hard as those guys did, probably harder, because, Murray Chess and Phil Pepe and Dick Young didn't have to worry about, 55 Instagram and social media posts every day to keep up with the other guys in the beat. These guys do. So they work every bit as hard, but it's different. I mean, even when I started at the Post, Brian, if you had if you picked up the Daily News, and they had a story, you had to live with that for a full day.
Well, that, yeah.
The internet was around, but Twitter wasn't.
Hmm.
And so you weren't able to just, kind of confirm or whatnot 3 minutes later. You had to wait 24 hours and hope to God you got something that could at least equal that, if not top it, or else you were going to hear about it from your editor for the rest of the week.
So
So
one thing I love in the book is I think every chapter, if not most chapters, has a little interlude that
yeah,
you kind of throw in. Where did that idea come from?
you know what? Just we talked about the Irabu one, but Um, a lot of those, not all of those interludes have to do with like the silliness of covering George. There's a lot of them that do, but like look, I mean, it allowed me to tell like the ancillary stories of George. Like his Seinfeld appearances, which of course is you could do that within the context of a book, but I think if you break it out, and I've had Larry David tell me about that, and so being able to use that. And Oliver Platt talked to me about playing George and what it meant to, he thought it was going to make him into a cartoon. And the more he got to know who he was, he wanted to actually play him right. It became one of his favorite roles of all time. I mean, those are the kind of things that, there were two places to put that. You could either put that in these interludes, which I did a couple of times, and I started every chapter with a quote. And sometimes they were standard quotes: Reggie Jackson on George, Billy Martin on George, George on George. But there's the Billy Joel song, the Yankees grab the headlines every time. That's directly about George Steinbrenner, and Billy Joel was a Yankees fan. There's a great scene in the movie Rounders where one of the
Hmm.
one of the guys Mike McD delivers to says, "Can Steinbrenner really just move the Yankees to Jersey?" So they have that conversation until you recreate it. I mean, the famous Billy Martin George Steinbrenner commercial, the Miller Lite commercial, which is still available on YouTube 45 years later and is still hilarious. You know, those I decided that was the best way to tell that aspect of the story. I guess I was influenced. I was actually influenced by a book. It's funny how these things work in your brain, right? There was a book that Bob Clappus and John Harper wrote many years ago called "The Worst Team Money Can Buy," about the '92 New York Mets. And the way they did it, and I've told them, only they both become very good friends of mine subsequently, but I told them, and this is the truth, I learned how to cover a baseball team by reading that book. Now, it was like basically 60% just a straightforward narrative about that awful season and how hilarious it was just to be that bad, for costing that much. But they would have every chapter, they would have basically notes about what it was like to actually be in the trenches covering that. Now, I'm not sure how much that appealed to the regular baseball fan who doesn't care about newspapers, but for me, it certainly was, as I told him, honestly, it was a textbook for how to do it, what to expect. I mean, I know it did, where I was, I know it did about multiple editions to newspaper, stuff like that, and what you had to do in between editions, what a running story was. I mean, it really was a textbook, but it also was entertaining. That was the most entertaining parts of the book because it was these guys just telling stories like they would in a press box or in a bar or in a restaurant. And I think that's kind of what I tried to do with the interludes because there really is a different tone, I think,
Hmm.
to all of them than they are to the rest of the chapters that surround them.
You talked about your voice and writing this book in your voice and having developed that. And this is such a tough question, I think, especially when talking with young writers or student writers, because oh, you've developed your voice and write like you. It sounds easy. It's not. It's very, very hard. So how did what advice do you have when you talk to like classes like mine or other students or other young writers into how do you develop a voice to where you sound like you rather than, you know, the impression of Mike Vaccaro trying to be, you know, like the cover band of the cover band
Now,
trying to sound like somebody. How do you
so
develop a voice?
so Brian, did you ever have the great privilege of taking a class from Dr. Jim Martini at Bonaventure,
Yes,
English
sir.
professor?
Hmm.
So for those who don't know, Dr. Martini was there for years. He was a Philly guy, went to Temple, loved, as he called it, Mother Bonas, was just an iconic, a larger than life presence, but also a larger than life man and a brilliant scholar. I mean, he probably wrote 50 books and he was just a delight to take class from, not an easy teacher. It wasn't quite as hard as Professor Keenan, whose first words to you every class were A's are for God, B's are for me, and C's are for you if you're lucky. So it wasn't that hard, but he was pretty hard, pretty demanding, and especially people that he thought had interest in the subject matter and maybe some writing ability, he was especially hard on. And later on, I worked my first 2 years at the Olean Times Herald, and so he got to read me every day, and he read me in the BV, but he really started to read me every day and with great interest in the Times Herald. And he also worked on the stats crew at Bonnie's games. And one day he came over to me in the only way that only he could. He's like, it's hilarious. I read this writer the other day. He writes just like you. He must be heavily influenced by you. I said, really? Who? And he's like, Michael Lupica. He said he must have just started to read you because he writes just like you. And of course, he was giving it to me because what he was trying to tell me is please stop trying to imitate him because you don't need to. And I know I probably was because he was the guy that I read more than anybody else. And so, there's a difference between stealing and plagiarism. I mean, it's a fine line, I suppose. Clearly, I wasn't plagiarizing him, but I was, if you read enough of somebody, their trick phrases and their catchphrases and whatnot, and so you find yourself doing that. And it's funny because Lupica many years later has complained to other people that I'm still a Lupica knockoff. So I guess but I find it a compliment for him to tell me that now as opposed to then. But it was a very important lesson, because he absolutely owned me on that one. He was right. I mean, and I went back and I looked like, what am I doing here? I mean, this isn't, I can do this job without having to, but here's the thing. I mean, all writing is derivative. I believe that, right? So, but you borrow from different places. You don't just borrow from this writer or that writer or that writer or that writer. Sadly, I actually knew somebody, who during the who got in trouble later on for it, not as much trouble as he should have, who was known to go to his desk and actually like type into his column like full passages from the National, which he would have on his desk, which is, that's a whole different subject, a whole different podcast. And that's not what I'm talking about. And look, I mean, there's a there's a guy I know Mike Sealski very well, right? And he used to get the same, and it was hilarious because it was true. People would say, not only do you write like Woj, but you specifically married a woman named Amy, and you had two kids, and you made sure you named them Annie and Ben. That's how closely his work used to be to Woj, and he subsequently found his voice. And Mike, like myself, he's willing to admit, yeah, I probably was a little bit too influenced by the 700 times he used the word "understand" to start a paragraph, which Woj, probably copyrighted about 1993 or so. But that happens, and look, I mean, sure, it's a form of flattery, but it's also, if you want to get better, you just have to get beyond that. You can't be a cheap knockoff of somebody. But I think it's okay to be influenced by it, and that's what I tell. That's why I say, I think I told you, what is it, 67 years ago when we first met,
Something about that, yeah.
yeah, that, you know what, read everything. I mean, my mantra has always been, and this came from Doc Simpson, another one of our mentors at St. Bonaventure. Writing is a muscle. It's just like, your biceps, your triceps. You go to the gym, you work it out. You need reps to make sure you get those muscles stronger. And writing is a muscle, and writing is something that only gets better the more you write and the more you read. And that was the second part of the equation. Read everything. Read every newspaper, news outlet, blog, magazine, book. Everything. Read everything, even the bad stuff, even the awful stuff. I mean, when I say awful, I mean the poorly constructed stuff, because that'll teach you what not to do, in addition to telling you what to do. And if you're influenced, you're probably not going to be so shameless as to directly quote from Twelfth Night. But there might be a little Shakespeare influence in you in the way you present a story or tell a story, and maybe you'll swipe a phrase here or a phrase there. But look, I mean, the words weren't copyrighted by anybody. We're allowed to borrow the words and put them in the order we want. But after a while, you figure out how to do that where it sounds like it's coming from you. And look, I mean, you filter that through the lessons that we were both taught by Chuck Pollock at the OTH, which, he was the most conversational writer any of us has ever known. When you read Chuck Pollock in the newspaper, you were talking to Chuck Pollock across from, over a beer. He wrote exactly how he talked. And, you learn to realize that that's a great gift. And, I don't know that I necessarily write exactly how I talk, but I certainly write more conversationally now than I ever did when Chuck had to pretty much take these sledgehammers and just hack away all the purple prose so you get to the score.
So my one Doc Martini story, he's still influencing my classes today because I have students read, I call them exemplars, right? So like just great pieces of like journalism, sports journalism, historical stuff, newer stuff. And the idea is just you have to read a lot to be good at what you do. And I always think of Doc Martini when we'd be reading The Crucible or something in English lit class, and he'd be like, guys, educated people read this shit for fun. And that always stuck with me as to your point, you read good stuff, and that's how you just exist in the world. But if you're going to be doing this at all for a living, there's something to be said for making sure you do that.
You know what? I didn't know always practice what I preach, to be honest with you, Brian. If I'm being very honest, I think I let a lot of great, a lot of great literature and books through the years slip through the cracks because I was always obsessed with reading journalism. I was always kind of known, even when I was a kid, to be the guy who got an armful of newspapers. And when the internet became available and it was, all the papers were free, I would read, 20, 25 sports sectors every day. And, and whatever. I mean, that's what I was consumed with, the Sports Illustrateds that came in the mail, that kind of thing. And so I left a real gap in like my just everyday pleasurable reading. And I've been really fortunate the last 2 years or so. A buddy of mine, and he found himself with the same problem. He'd been busy getting after it in his 20s, 30s, and 40s, didn't read anything. And so we basically built a two-man book club where he picks a book, we read it for 2 weeks. I pick a book, we read it for 2 weeks, and so we've read some Faulkner, we've filled in some gaps with our Fitzgerald reading, we've read some Shakespeare, and we've read and Raymond Chandler. I mean, all the gamut. And I feel so much fuller as a writer now because I've now read these books that I've always wanted to quote but couldn't because I never read them.
So that gets us to our final question that we always ask. What's the best thing that you've read lately?
1929 was a book. Sorkin wrote it, and he's terrific. He's who am I to say that Sorkin is terrific? But he's great. Obviously, Too Big to Fail is an essential reading, but so is 1929 because it tells a part of the country's history that is a fundamental and essential part of the history that nobody really knows about. Nobody really understands how it happened, why it happened. Why did we have a Great Depression? Why did the stock market crash? What's a stock market crash? Some people like myself are so simple. It's like, well, you know, what's a margin call? I mean, a lot of us just don't know that, even if we actually take part in these things. We have advisors and so forth to help us with, but it was just to me, it's the template for a not for a nonfiction book that reads like a fiction book. I think you and I have talked about the book, which is my favorite book of all time in any genre, which is Hellhound on His Trail, which is Hampton Sides, and it's about the pursuit of James L. Ray after he assassinated Martin Luther King. And it's the same kind of book like that, where you're reading it and you can't stop reading it because it's like a potboiler, it's a thriller, and every word of it is true. And it's even more impressive to a degree because you're talking about a time that's now almost a century ago. And it felt like you were in 1929 with these characters, all of whom were managing to basically almost bring the U.S. economy to the brink of extinction. And he's not unfair to any of them. I mean, every one of these characters, even the ones who are most responsible, there was a flip side to all of them. So you get to know all of these people, and you realize that some people, even smart people, make mistakes, and sometimes they're bigger mistakes than others. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. So I highly recommend that. It's been on the New York Times list for I think 29 weeks, and I hope it's on for 29 more because it's a book that everybody should read.
And that is Mike Vaccaro. You can get his new book, Bosses of the Bronx, wherever you get books. We'll have links to buy them. Buy it in show notes, whether you want to get it at Amazon or your independent bookstore. Mike, as always, this was great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, Brian, I would have asked you the same question, but I know your answer would have been Bosses of the Bronx. So why waste
So here,
anybody's time,
so
right?
so here's the thing. Yes, but it always feels so disingenuous to say that when I'm talking to somebody. So I will say I just started reading Cameron Crowe's memoir,
Oh,
Uncool,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah. Well, my book's going to be there, going to be at number one for about 15 seconds because if you're on page 10 of Cameron Crowe's book, that's a book that I wish would have gone on for 200 more pages. And honestly, that if 1929 is 1A, then the Uncool is 1B because I wish that book would go on for 200, 300 more pages because it's just incredible. Also, all true. And
Mhm.
you're not going to believe what kind of a life this guy lived in his like teens and 20s, which is just preposterous.
So thank you for Mike again. Thanks for being here. This was fantastic. Good luck with the book, and we'll do this again soon.
Thank you, Brian. I'll see you soon.
Yep. And thank you for listening to the other 51. We do this every month. Jen Moritz does all of our graphics. Our theme song is by Ellie Moritz. I'm Brian, and I'll talk to you next time.